Hello, this is Stephen, and this is the Bureau of Lost Culture. For many of us, growing up was a troubled transition from the strange world of childhood to the much stranger world of becoming who we are. But how much more difficult is it then and now if you should start to realise that your nature is not one that's approved of by society or understood even by the people around you? My guest today tells an extraordinary story, his story in the first of two parts, about his journey from a troubled youth, recovering from a suicide attempt, despairing and lost, to becoming a success, a well-loved broadcaster and a well-known activist who helped further the causes of his own counterculture. A successful musician in over 20 albums with hit singles, the writing of a protest song, which even though prescribed by the very BBC where he was later to become a broadcaster, it remains an extraordinary rallying cry for the counterculture. For more on him in a moment. If this is your first visit to the Bureau, welcome, and if you're coming back for more, welcome back. Thanks for joining us. Thanks especially to my correspondents of the last couple of weeks. Ronnie, of course, James, another Stephen, Lucy, Sophie and Roger. Great suggestions. You can send your own suggestions, if you like, of course, to bureauoflostculture@gmail.com. And if you're interested to join us this month in London, we have a whole series of events around Allen Ginsberg, particularly in the way that he helped trigger the Summer of Love. Check it out, bureauoflostculture.com. You can sign up for our newsletter to hear about that and other upcoming events. Well, during that Summer of Love in 1967, there was a major legal move forward when homosexuality was decriminalised. The age of consent was still 21, of course. It was too late and too little for many, though not, thankfully, for my guest today. Though, as we will hear, he may have been rather unaware of that change and some of the other changes in society in the strange community he was then sheltering in. I've been trying to get him on the show for some time, so I'm very pleased that he's here with me. And he is a very handsome and very young-looking 73. Welcome, Tom Robinson.
Hello, Stephen. How are you?
Good to see you again. I thought we'd just dive straight in with a little bit of your life and times. You were actually born all the way back, was it 1950?
1950 it was. I had my formative years as a teenager in Saffron Walden in the northwest corner of Essex.
Right.
And went to a co-educational boarding school as a day scholar.
Quaker school, right?
Yeah. The main thing about the Quaker sect religiously is that they don't have priests, they don't have any clergy. The services that they have on Sundays consist of people sitting in a room in silence. The idea is that if God's trying to say something to you, how could you possibly hear him if you're busy singing hymns and stuff? So people just gather together in a Quaker meeting, as they call it, and meditate. And the silence in that room full of people not saying anything just deepens as the minutes tick by. And about, sort of 10, 15 minutes in, it's kind of like it goes off a coastal shelf into deep silence. And you hear motorbikes outside and stuff. And then anybody can get up and say anything, testify just what they're feeling at the time or a thought that's occurred to them, and then the silence closes back over everyone's heads, and then somebody might get up and recite a prayer. Anyway, that's the Society of Friends, and they ran a co-educational boarding school for people of a Quaker persuasion.
I mean, what was your family like?
Well, my family, actually, my dad was a profound atheist, but only in the way that somebody who was going to train to be a priest and lost his faith could be. And so he was passionately humanist. But he felt that his children should be exposed to religion so they could know what they were turning away from.
Love it.
Rather than in ignorance of it. So he sent, I think, all of his children at one point or another to a Quaker boarding school. And he used to drag us off to C of E services from time to time. just because he thought we ought to know what we were rejecting.
He sounds quite enlightened. I mean, so you're at this school, which it sounds fairly liberal, fairly progressive, right? I mean, at the same time, early 60s, were you aware of the sort of the radical changes that were going on in the wider society, the beginnings, if you like, of this thing we call counterculture?
Yes. The arrival of the Beatles coincided with me, almost with me arriving at the school. I think by the time I was 13, the Beatles had their first #1 hits, and rapidly followed by the whole of the arrival of Motown and soul music and the British blues boom and all the rest of it. But catastrophically, I fell in love at age 15. You know how the stories and the pop songs and the magazines and the movies tell you that your first love affair as a teenager is this time of awakening and glory and all the rest of it. Well, it was total disaster as far as I was concerned, because I fell in love with someone of the wrong sex. At that time, a homo was not a good thing to be. The whole culture of the school was boy meets girl, because the sixth formers were pairing off and going out with each other and holding hands as they walked up and down the avenue at the school at recreation times. You were warned against homosexuals before you knew you were one. That was the experience for so many of us, and probably still is today, you know, to some extent, except with this crucial difference. In the 60s, homosexuality was criminalized, so that men who had sex with other men went to prison for 4 years. So there were no role models, not one person out there as an example to tell you you could have a happy life. The only future you could look forward to was either you were a sinner, or you were sick, or you were a criminal. Homosexuality was either criminalized or demonized or medicalized. It wasn't really a great prospect. I would rather have died than tell anybody at the school I was in love with this other boy, and including him.
Right. So I was going to ask you about that. I mean, the object of your affections, there was no possible way that you could express that to him.
No, I mean, to be honest, I was quite a fucked up kid anyway, and isolated and living in a fantasy world of my own. So a lot of this love affair was going on in my head. I was admiring from afar. I was pretty much a stalker is what I was, although I didn't actually inflict my own desires or any of that on him.
When that sort of realization and the crisis that it precipitated in consciousness, I suppose, did it rush in on you? Okay, I'm gay. And then did the sort of the consequences of that then sort of start to kind of bleed in? You know, all the things which you just mentioned, all the kind of, you know, the potential issues that was going to cause.
Well, the one thing you didn't want to say was, I'm gay. Accepting who you actually were is always hard for queer kids, I think, for some more than others. And back then, for some more than others, not everyone of my age had such a miserable time of it. Some were cheerfully getting on with having sex everywhere they could, you know, and cheerfully enjoying their lives. So I think it's the fact that I was a lonely, isolated, fucked up kid was the real crux of the matter, rather than the fact that I fancied another boy. However, one way or another, it precipitated a suicide attempt followed by a nervous breakdown. By this point, my parents had moved away and I was boarding at the boarding school, and I took an overdose, went to bed hoping never to wake up. And next morning I woke up in the dormitory, and it took about 2 seconds to realize I shouldn't have woken up, and I was so useless that I couldn't even kill myself. Thank God I didn't. You know, and we have to say, for anybody listening to this, there is help out there which I didn't have at that time in those days. And the fact that I'm here talking to you means that help works. So if anybody is really on the edge of despair, not wanting to inhabit their own skin a second longer, for God's sake, pick up the telephone. The helplines are there, and you don't have to suffer alone.
But you did, though. So you woke up. You had to sort of take a nosedive into a pit of sort of worthlessness that I can't even do this thing. I can't even finish it, you know.
Exactly right. It was as if a string had broken. Something had snapped inside me. So it took 10 minutes to put my socks on. I was in floods of tears. I couldn't actually get it together to even kind of make it out of the dormitory and get down to breakfast and turn up for lessons and stuff. And pretty soon the school noticed something was wrong, and I got sent to the headmaster's study, and he said, we can't have you going on in this state. You might end up trying to harm yourself. And I just said I just did. And they immediately shipped me off to a mental hospital in Cambridge. So it's interesting. Obviously, medical was the first port of call.
There was no conversation about what it was then. It was just that you're in danger of self-harm, so we've got to put you in a mental hospital. There wasn't an inquiry into why that might be.
I had said why. But when I got to Douglas House in Cambridge, which was an outpost of Addenbrooke's Hospital, I was told to put my pajamas on and get into bed because I was ill. And they took my temperature and put it on the chart at the end of the bed.
Right.
Then a psychiatrist came around and evaluated me, and I was given some medication that I had to take, which was like a liquid kosh,
Right.
It was basically Largactil or something. And then was a period in kind of hell in hospital where they'd come and ask kind of inane questions like, what makes you think you're a homosexual? The fact that I'm in love with this other boy. Well, have you had sex with him? No, of course I fucking haven't. Have you had sex with another boy? No. Well, you're not a homosexual. And a homosexual is somebody that has sex with other people of the same sex. So technically, you're actually not a homosexual. So let's not have any of that nonsense. Showing me inkblot tests and what can you see in these. And it was a miserable fucking time. And even the pop music of the day that in the autumn of 1966 was What Becomes of the Broken-Hearted coming on endlessly on the run. And the Kinks,
right.
The Kinks singing Dead End Street,
right.
Really depressing, bloody music. Then just at the end of 66, along comes a band called Cream, and they have this single, I Feel Free. And it's like a hint that something else could be dawning, because we were on the cusp of 1967, right, where the world changed utterly in that one year. And it was pre-shadowed by the music at the end of 66. And the beginning of 67, this thoughtful Quaker headmaster of mine arranges for me to go and have an interview at a place called Finchdon Manor, where I get ushered into an oak-panelled study and the presence of a 74-year-old man in a tweed jacket and dirty old plastic-rimmed glasses, slightly stooping. He comes up to me and takes my hand in both of his and peers over his glasses at me and holds my hand for longer than is comfortable. And he looks penetratingly at me and he goes, hello. He says, you're very lonely, aren't you? And it was like, after all the medical nonsense, suddenly somebody who got it like that, first shot,
bang,
bullseye. I was so fucking lonely, I wanted to cry on the spot. And I talked to him for an hour, and it was like, suddenly, here's somebody who understands, absolutely non-judgmental about anything. Oh, so these boys that you dream about, do they have faces? Who are they? Well, they're just sort of faceless. So, oh my goodness, you do live in a fantasy world, don't you? Not judging you. So I then get shown out around this place, and it's a Jacobean manor house in the Weald of Kent, in its own grounds, inhabited by 50 youths aged anything between 14 and 24, and 10 staff, and about 20 or 30 cats, and about 8 dogs in unheated bedrooms scattered around the premises, old shacks, and there's 3 grand pianos, a vegetable garden, a rose garden, a pond that boys were fishing in. By the pond, a log cabin that 2 boys had built for a bet, a pottery where they dug their own clay out and were making their own things. people mending radios, making mobiles and sculptures. This world that was so different from the Quaker boarding school. And everybody was like long-haired and dirty and ragged clothed and wandering around in bare feet and jeans. And it was scary as fuck, but it was vibrantly alive. One way or another, at the end of the day, having seen this extraordinary place, I'm shown back into Mr. Lywood's study, and he says, well, we're full up and we've got a long waiting list, and we don't normally take boys as sick as you anyway. And he says, do you want to come? And
great.
It's like, take it or leave it. Make your jump now. Jump with both feet or don't, And he just wanted to see if I could just go yes and accept what was being offered. Because if I dithered and havered, they wouldn't have taken me. I said yes, unhesitatingly. It was like seizing life with both hands instead of going back to slow death at the Quaker boarding school.
Sounds like an absolutely signal moment then. I mean, like, you'd been met by him effectively, hadn't you, by his response to you when you arrived. I mean, that sort of first empathetic hello, also quite scary though in some ways, right?
Very scary, yeah. I mean, it was, the boys there had come from a variety of backgrounds. Some like me had come from school, but some had come from mental hospitals. Some had come from the criminal justice system, would have been in a borstal otherwise. So boys from wildly different backgrounds from me. But the communal living was the essence of the therapy there. So it was a community, its own unique thing. But rather than it being formal therapy, the therapy was mostly the fact of having to live with 50 other people and rub along one way or another together and do the chores and do the cooking and do the cleaning. And if you decided not to do your washing up, nobody got to eat. So that's kind of quite forceful therapy, really, if you've got 49 hungry people looking at you. Or else, if some boy is throwing a wobbler and he can't get it together to do his washing up, somebody else will step in and just do it.
Right.
Fuck it. It may be your turn, but I'm going to do it. Let's have lunch.
That's proper counterculture in a way, isn't it? I mean, Alan Moore said to me, if you had to put it in one word, it's community, really.
And the interesting thing about community is it isn't all thinking the same thing or believing the same thing or all being like each other. It's actually difference that makes community.
And your difference, your inner world that sort of been sprung on you, and did that become easier to be that, to even communicate about it?
Yeah, because I wasn't the only one.
Right.
And nobody was pretending. At school, we were all pretending. We were trying to conform to what we thought would pass. So, of course, there were other boys there who liked other boys. Inevitably, I ended up going to bed with one of them, or more than one of them. In terms of my guilty secret that had made me so wretched and so ashamed, it just became a matter of teasing and laughter. We had, in the dining room, it was all terribly primitive, just trestle tables with benches and stuff, and food just being slopped down on plates by the boy who happened to be serving at the time. But our salt arrived in a big catering tin that was kind of half a meter tall, and it was passed from table to table, and you just take a handful of salt out if you wanted it. And people would scrape messages on the salt tin. It was like the community notice board. And one day I noticed somebody had scratched on this tin, "If all the boys lived over the sea, what a good swimmer Tom would be." It was very fun. That was how my homosexuality had changed from being 16 or being 15 and terrified and shamed to it just being a bit of a joke Tom's a bit of a one for the boys. Everybody knew, you couldn't have an affair with another boy there and the people not know.
It's astonishing contrast, isn't it, between these two places then?
This is only my experience and observation. And I'm not speaking for the whole community or for anything else. But it seemed to me in the course of my 6 years there that I actually ended up, that perhaps 20% of us maybe were absolutely, completely heterosexual. No hint of a shade of bisexuality in there at all. If you made a pass at them, they'd say, "Go away, I don't like you, fuck off." And they'd be sort of mildly irritated and just laugh at you. But there were also boys who would go, "Backs against the wall, chaps. Oh, no, look out for the homos." And generally the ones that made a fuss about it were the ones who sooner or later would end up in bed with someone else at least once in their lives while they were there. And then about 20% of us had a preference for the same sex. So in any kind of enclosed all-male community, be it the Navy, be it prison, whatever it is, then people's innate bisexuality is likely to come to the fore, and people are going to act a lot more queer in those circumstances than they would just in the course of their daily lives outside. So,
also, I mean, like in this sort of these three strands, I think that I sort of see winding through, your life. I mean, sexuality is one of them, but the other big thing which happens there, you're listening to John Peel's The Perfumed Garden, right, on Radio London, and then you get this visit from Alexis Corner, right, which seemed to waken something else up in you, right?
Yeah, I mean, the sex that I've just been talking about was really quite a small part of the total experience, and nothing like the most interesting thing about that place. It was an extraordinary experiment in education, really, and not everybody liked it. Since the internet age, old boys from Finchdon Manor have been able to get back together again and talk and discuss, and I've met people and found out about their backgrounds before they went there and what their lives had been like. And not everybody loved it. Not everybody felt they benefited from being there. But for me, it was an absolute lifesaver. And one of the strands of that was that there was a lot of music. So there were, as I say, grand pianos scattered around the place. There were some boys who were like close to concert grade in their piano playing. There were boys who could play violin really well. There were jazz musicians. It was where I actually got to play a lot of music with other sort of guitarists and drummers and people. But Alexis Corner arriving in '69 as an old boy of the place.
Ah, right. He'd been there himself.
Yeah. He came down to see Mr. Lywood and offered to play a concert in Mr. Lywood's study, in that oak panelled study. And we all squeezed in somehow. It was rammed. And this grizzled 45-year-old man in a flowery shirt and with a shock of grizzled hair kind of takes a guitar out of a case and straps it on and opens his mouth and sings in the room. And, I thought that pop music was something you had to do with a microphone and a drum kit. And it was the sheer informality of Alexis singing the blues. And he was somebody who knew what he was singing about. I mean, he was Muddy Waters was the godfather of his daughter. He had Big Bill Roonsie to stay every time he came to London. He rubbed shoulders with John Lee Hooker. He absolutely was accepted by authentic American blues people as a blues man in his own right and in his own standing. So his take on the blues was unique and central to him, but he sang about corrupt police and hard-hearted women and injustice and racism and all the rest of it. And it was riveting to see somebody be so unself-conscious. And you realize that watching Alexis is all about communication.
Right.
It was actually just He opened his mouth, he sang direct to us. You didn't need a microphone. You didn't need any special equipment or any special thing whatsoever. It was just charisma in the raw. And it was how you sang and how you engaged with the people you were singing to that counted, not the peripherals. And he did totally engage with it. Immeasurable musicality, just opening his heart and his music and his soul to us and singing. And there was something in the way that Alexis sang in that room that day that made me think, oh my God, I want to be like that.
Was that the moment?
Well, I saw that it was possible, that I didn't think anything was in reach. But when you saw that you only have to pick a guitar up and you can do the essence of it, you don't even need the instrument, really. You just have to sing and mean it.
The other major thing which has happened is that in your time there, and 1967, the Summer of Love, but also this landmark countercultural year for gay rights in the UK, right? The passing of the Sexual Offences Act, so decriminalising homosexuality on condition they were 21 consensual and it's in private. Because that was a sort of outside world in a way, wasn't it? And I mean, like, how did that feel as it happened?
I wasn't aware of it. I was enclosed in my own little world anyway, my own set of concerns, living in that community in that strange world. Plus, I didn't want to think of myself as a homosexual in 67. It was still too raw and too new, everything. And even while I was at Finchton and cheerfully, being one, I didn't want to think of myself that as being my final identity until I left and moved to London at age 23 in 1973.
Straight to London, straight into the heart of it then?
I didn't want to go back to living with my family and using that as a base. I wanted to have my own separate life from my father. I managed to get a job in a music publisher's office, paid £18 a week, and I got digs with the landlady in Clapham.
And tell us, what was that like? 1973, it's come up many times in this programme. You got the kind of countercultural of the 60s and all that kind of, the idealism and that wonderful flowering of new consciousness and ideas. But then you go into the 70s and it gets darker, doesn't it? The economic climate, the actual climate of Britain at the time is quite different, isn't it? And what was it like for you arriving in this big city in Clapham?
Well, it's almost like the reverse of what I told you about 67 and the law reform. When I moved to London in 73, my world was involved in homosexuality. I moved to London and made a conscious decision, I was going to be myself. I was going to not hide. I was going to live openly one way or another and just say, yes, this is my life. I'm going to get on with it now. I've spent 7 years in the hope of finding a cure. And the cure that I got was I was cured of my shame and guilt and self-hatred. That was the thing I needed to be cured of, not the attraction to members of the same sex. Having been cured of it, I decided on moving to London that I was going to live a new life. So in the back of Time Out, I find there's agitprop, there's women's affairs, and then gay as a section. And there's a list of gay venues and pubs and clubs. And I'll go, oh my God. And I'll go to Earl's Court and go to the Boltons, which was the kind of epicenter of the gay scene in Earl's Court. Go there by tube and I stand outside and I see all these attractive young men walking openly off the street into this gay pub, walking out. They don't care. Anybody sees them going in or coming out. They're just being themselves. They're just living. This was liberating. I mean, amazing. So I started going to the gay scene in Earl's Court indiscriminately because it was just such a refreshing change from the suffocation that I'd had at school in the 60s.
67, the law had changed. And in these 6 years, things had moved quite a lot. I mean, for instance, International Times, Free Press, classified ads. There's gay people openly advertising. I know that International Times got in trouble for that at times. Just give us the culture of that, what had happened, say, in London, where by the time you got there, you could go to Earl's Court and see that and participate in that.
Time Out was on the fringe of that whole thing. It was the kind of newsagent, respectable kind of open door into the counterculture. So that took me to Earl's Court. In Earl's Court, the gay news seller came round once a fortnight. And as soon as I got my first copy of Gay News, there was my counterculture right there. That suddenly the thing that had been the big issue that had dominated my misery in my teens, that had kind of dwindled away to just a part of my life while at Finchton Manor, was now stage centre at the heart of my social life. Gay News was just like a stick of dynamite tossed into my life. We forget in the internet age, access to information was really hard to get. You couldn't go to a library and find a directory of what was gay or where, at least until Gay News came along. Now, once I got my Gay News, I was aware that there was also something called Gay Switchboard going to be being talked about, being founded the following year. There was Gay Sweatshop Theatre Company. There was Sappho magazine. There was Lunch magazine. There was South London Gay Community Centre. There was North London GLF Disco at the Prince Albert every Saturday night.
Gay Liberation Front.
The Gay Liberation Front, although it no longer existed as a unified body, had fragmented and exploded, all firing off new things happening. And Gay News was by far the most important, I think, at that time, because it gave us a sense of community. It meant that you could actually subscribe to it in a brown paper envelope wherever you were in the UK, and you could find out where things were happening, what things were happening. And the key thing about it was it had no pornography in it. That would have been fatal for them anyway in terms of the censors. But it was a deliberate policy as well that we can have a newspaper that's got news in it. Of course, it had personal ads at the back, but basically it was information. And then, having started to absorb gay news and looking forward every fortnight to the next issue coming out, I then found you could buy it on the newsstand at Clapham Common Tube Station. So I was commuting into work at my music publishers in Leicester Square. And so I then bought my next Gay News off the newsstand and decided to read it on the tube openly. And I stood on the tube very defiantly in a crowded carriage reading my Gay News. And I became aware of this figure behind me, like a city gent, kind of bowler hat. But I imagined a moustache and a rolled up umbrella and a briefcase and pinstripe suit. And this kind of clearing of throats behind me. And I knew he was going to say something. And just before my stop, he went, the fortnights just seem to fly by, don't they?
I love it.
If ever there was an affirmation, you are not alone.
Something that he would have never dared to have done, but probably rejoiced in your doing it.
Exactly so. And so by the same token, I saw in the back of Gay News that there was a gay ball organised by the South London gay community taking place at a civic hall in Stockwell that November. I just counted off the weeks until it came up, because this was right in my neck of the woods and on a Saturday night. And when it finally came around, I put on what I imagined were my most attractive looking clothes and got on the tube to Stockwell and walked to the Surrey halls. And my heart sank as I rounded the corner, because there was a gang of youths outside. And I thought, oh, Christ, I'm going to get beaten up. And as I got close to them, I saw they were all wearing Gay Liberation Front badges. And it was my tribe. This wasn't the piss elegant gay crowd, all, Queenie and dressed up to the nines. There's nothing wrong with being Queenie, but so elaborately gay that you saw in Earl's Court, or the leather guys that you saw at the Coleherne Earl's Court. This was just ordinary looking blokes and women loitering outside as a welcoming committee. And I went in, and the vibe in that rented hall was instantly familiar from school dances, village dances, everything that I'd seen as a teenager. Everyone's sitting around the outside looking at each other. Up on the platform, there's kind of ramshackle arrangement of kind of homemade amplifiers and borrowed record decks, and everybody piling their records in to be part of the disco. And then the music starts, and everyone gets up, and then the boys dance with the boys, and the girls dance with the girls, and it's fucking extraordinary. I go, oh my God, that's what dancing is.
Love it.
You fancy the other person. It's a mating ritual. The moment of getting up on my feet as the music started, going to an attractive man on the other side of the room and saying, "Do you want to dance?" Then going, "Yeah, all right," and dancing with me. It was just a whole new world. The law change just meant that those gay pubs didn't have to be quite so secret. It was still clandestine. Gay liberation, following on from the Stonewall riot in New York in '69 and arriving in London by that summer or the summer after. So I only saw the aftermath of that happening. But that was the thing that made us stand up and say, yeah, I'm me. Get used to it. We're here. We're queer. That was the really fucking liberating thing, was being able to live openly. So at that dance, I got a load of pamphlets, which I read avidly and which became part of who I was. And I bought some badges too. And I went into work and I wore a badge that said, "Come out." It wasn't quite bold enough to say I'm gay, but it had a little fist and a butterfly and the slogan, "Come out." And as I walked into work, one of the typists in the typing pool, one of the women there, rushed up to me, "Oh, I like your badge. What's that about? What's the badge?" I chickened out. I didn't say anything. I said, "Look, it's one of those things you either know or you don't know." And I just fluffed it and changed the subject. And next day I went into work without the badge. And she came up to me again with her purse. And she said, "You know that badge you were wearing yesterday?" I said, "Yes." She said, "It's rather like this one, isn't it? An ode to purse." And inside was a Gay Liberation Front fist, the purple badge. And she had it in her purse. And again, I put my badge back on next day, you know. It was again like the guy on the tube. It was, we're everywhere.
I mean, that must have been a wonderful feeling. You mentioned taking the newspaper and in some ways your life into your own hands and getting on the tube at Clapham, coming north, right, and deciding, I'm going to do this. I'm going to be out in this situation. Tell us a little bit about what there was to fear still. I mean, some work had been done, but there's a hell of a lot more to do. And, you know, what were the risks then for somebody like you, you know, at that time, you know, living in London, living in Clapham?
Violence. You know, that's the thing even today. If you're in the wrong place at the wrong time, holding hands with the wrong person or kissing the wrong person.
Was it a kind of constant part of your consciousness, in a sense, in the city?
It was a constant terror that made me very, very fucking careful not to be in the wrong place, holding hands with the wrong person. I met my first proper boyfriend on the tube because I was going to the North London Gay Liberation Front disco at the Prince Albert. And I saw this very attractive youth about my own age with curly hair, crossed over to the other platform and searched everywhere, sat on a bench looking right and left to see where he was. And he was sitting next to me, smiling. And, you know, he said, "Where are you off to then?" And I said, "I'm off to the Prince Albert in King's Cross." He said, "Funny, so am I." And we ended up having a love affair. And once I went out to his work, to meet him at work in his lunchtime, and we walked out in the park together and held hands. And there was a gang of schoolboys who started shouting queers, queers at us from a distance. And in my foolhardy way, I turned round and faced them and bellowed, "Come here and say that." And none of them did. Thank fuck, because I wouldn't have known what to do. I was always useless in fights, but it could have gone very badly wrong. And that was the constant.
Simultaneously, there's that sense of threat in the city, but then also you're making these connections, the woman at work, the guy with the umbrella and the bowler hat on the tube, and then your first boyfriend. So I'm sensing also this is when your activist side, which has been there throughout your life, we missed out the sort of the third part of the triangle here, because what about music? Tell us about that. And you mentioned this incendiary introduction to the possibilities of performance and communicating and music by Alexis Corner when you were in the community. But what about you and music in London?
When I moved to London, I didn't immediately have thoughts of trying to start a career in music. But I had two good friends who were both very good singers and both very good songwriters, a man called Hereward Kay. And he was a pretty good singer and songwriter, and he'd disappeared out of my life for a little bit. And there was also Raphael Doyle, who had been a boy at Finchton, and I'd sung songs with him, and we had started writing songs together after Alexis had been down to visit. And Hereward suddenly dropped into my life. He came back to London from the south of France, where he'd been bumming around and busking gigs. And he'd written some songs, and he sat down and played them to me and said, "I want to form a band with you. Listen to this." And he played like 3 songs, one after another, that just stunned me. I mean, stunning songs. And I thought, bloody hell, he really has got it. And what he doesn't have is the smallest idea how to put this across. I knew that with me directing, and particularly if we could get Raphael on board with his songs, we could do something together musically. And on the strength of those songs, I agreed that we should look at forming a band. All we had was 2 acoustic guitars between us and our 3 voices and these songs. So it seemed to me that what I could bring to the party was I had some arranging skill. If I do vocal arrangements for their songs, we could rock up at the folk clubs where you don't need any microphones or equipments or anything. You just take the guitars on the tube, and we could just get out and play and start getting heard. And that's what we did. We rehearsed in my landlady's cellar. We got those harmonies good, but we started getting heard around the place and turning up at folk clubs. And most floor spots, the performances aren't always top notch. And we were. So we would show up. They'd be glad to see us when we showed up to do a floor spot, because that night there would be at least one really polished thing before the main act came on. And then one night at Battersea Folk Club, the main act, they dropped out. They were called in sick or whatever. And the manager of Battersea Folk Club called up, said, "Can you come and do a headline set for us tonight at short notice?" And we were ready. We just got in the car and went and did a headline set. And we brought the house down. And we started moving into headline slots. And then we got our residency at the Troubadour Club.
I mean, the Troubadour, a legendary place, right, in Earl's Court,
where Bob Dylan had played and Simon had played. And, even in my time there, Tom Paxton came down and sat in. We started hosting our own night there. And it was at the Troubadour that Ray Davies came down to see us. And the night that Ray came, Alexis happened to be playing a guest as our special guest. We'd asked him to do as a guest slot, and he'd agreed. Unfortunately, Alexis had also brought not only his guitar, but some extremely strong red leb, and had got us completely out of our heads, stoned off our tits before Ray Davies arrived. So he went out and held the fort.
Tried to straighten up.
We tried to straighten up. Finally, Ray Davies got up and did a couple of songs. Waterloo Sunset.
I mean, that must have been a moment for you. You'd had this experience with Alexis Corner at Finchdown, and then there he is playing with you. And stoned with you.
Unreal. Yeah. He became a friend. I mean, he was a mentor for Cafe Society and later for the Tom Robinson Band. Offered advice, and when we needed him to come down and do our guest slot for us, rather, he did. And luckily, it was the same night that Ray Davies came down.
If the winter has caught you on the low, and the sun ain't the same one that you know, and your mind is getting worried by the cold, and your happiness seems fading and old, well then we'll all get together again, and we'll sit in a circle in the wind and the rain, with our friends all beside us to hold back the pain, and we'll sing to the sun, and the sun will come again. If the head you held so high up to the stars is hurt by growing thoughts of aging arms, and the song that we sang seems incomplete, and the dance that's swayed so free just hurts your feet, well then we'll all get together again, and we'll sit in a circle in the wind and the rain, with our friends all beside us to hold back the pain, and we'll sing to the sun, and the sun will come again.
And then Ray Davies wants you to sign to his label, like.
It wasn't the best relationship in the world at the time, but if we hadn't had that start, I probably wouldn't be talking to you now. I learned so much from that experience. So I owed Ray a huge debt of gratitude. And many, many years later, he came and did like a 3-hour interview with me at Six Music and talking about his music. And he was very gracious, and it was a really interesting conversation. And we didn't mention Konk Records once.
Just give us a picture of your London at the time. And what was the city like?
So London in the early 70s was like a kind of rundown version of the swinging London that we had known. There was still kind of hipster eateries, Portobello Market, lots of kind of leftover legacy kind of spin-offs from the 60s were still going. But overall, it was a feeling of it having run out of steam. And youth unemployment had become a major thing by 75, 76, for the first time, really, since the war. And it hadn't been experienced in the 60s. And the music of The Clash and the Sex Pistols did reflect very much what had been going on in the previous couple of years. So although it had not yet been vocalized, there was this sense of impending doom. And don't forget, the shadow of the mushroom cloud was still very much over us. The Cold War was still very cold. There was a deep sense of insecurity, and the Vietnam War had only just ground to a close, and not much optimism about the future. Glam rock had come and gone. We were into the era of prog. Cafe Society actually did a whole tour supporting Barclay James Harvest.
Wow. Give us a picture. Are you long-haired, big collars, flare trousers, the whole thing?
Yep. flared trousers, a mane of hair.
And then comes this thing called punk, right? And you saw the Sex Pistols early on, didn't you?
We were playing the Scarborough Penthouse Club up many flights of stairs that you had to carry the equipment up. So we have just played to an audience of, I don't know, 20 or 30 people at the most, probably less. And at the end of the night, the DJ comes on and goes, "Ladies and gentlemen, that were Cafe Society. Next week, we've got a band coming up from London. I don't know anything about them, but they're meant to be the worst band in Britain. And they're called the Sex Pistols." And you knew with that build-up, it was going to be rammed. The worst band in Britain called the Sex Pistols. Let's go and see that. So it was enough to whet my appetite. When I got back to London, I got out my copy of the NME to look and see where are these Sex Pistols playing. And they were playing at the 100 Club. And I went along to see it. And people have a false memory, of how great the punk times were and how everybody was all dressed in bondage strides and spiky hair. They weren't. There was a minority of the audience were dressed like the band, but the majority were dressed like me in long hair, flares, big collars and jumpers and leather jackets and stuff. Because they turned up late, they didn't tune up, and the first thing Rotten said when he got on stage was, "Who's gonna buy me a drink?" And they hadn't written most of the classic Sex Pistols songs at the time, but they just co-opted existing songs, and they did it very, very well by their own lights. These songs like "I'm Not Your Stepping Stone" and "What You Gonna Do About It," which only has 2 chords. But then what they did with the lyrics would kind of turn it into a Sex Pistols song kind of instantaneously. So, for instance, "What You Gonna Do About It," The Small Faces, is this twee little song. "I want you to know that I love you, baby. Want you to know that I care." Rotten, needless to say, he sings, "I want you to know that I hate you, baby. Want you to know I don't care. I'm so sorry when you're with me, and I'm glad when you're not there." And then he hits the chorus, "What you gonna do about it? What you gonna do about it?" And it's like confronting the audience. It's like, come on then, if you think you're hard enough. It was a challenge to the audience. It was extraordinary, the way they managed to create this whole vibe. And I hated it, because it was contrary to everything that I'd grown up with, that I'd learned from music hall, I'd learned from the Kinks. The idea that you entertain the audience, you do your best to do a professional show, you make sure you're in tune, all this kind of stuff. And they didn't bother about any of that shit. They didn't sing in tune, they didn't play in tune, they didn't keep in time. And it was absolutely 2 fingers up at the audience. And some of the audience was spitting at them, as was the kind of want, and the others were standing around bemused. And I left because I didn't want to be assaulted by this horrible din anymore. Right. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. I couldn't stop thinking about this thing, because it was clear that whatever the next big thing was, it wasn't going to be an acoustic harmony trio. It really wasn't. It was going to be something real and something heartfelt and something in your face and something quite tough. And I realized that I had to leave Cafe Society because it was going nowhere. Every time we got in the studio, Ray Davies would suddenly co-opt it the following week and say, "No, we need it for the Kinks." And your whole project would be abandoned all over again.
But that was a great moment, wasn't it, for you then? Because that was another kind of liberation, right?
It was a kind of liberation, because I realized that although I couldn't sing very well, it didn't matter. If Lydon could do it, I could do it, And I could never pull off the punk thing because I was 26 already. I was way too old and set in my ways and middle class to be able to properly pull off any kind of punk shtick.
You're also very melodic, right, as well?
I couldn't help it. It was just the way I'd grown up. It's the way I wrote songs. And so was Elvis Costello. And So was Ian Dury.
Joe Jackson.
Joe Jackson, yeah. There was loads of people who came through at the same time, where the punks kicked open the doors at EMI and CBS, and the rest of us piled in through behind them. They made opportunities available for us that hadn't been there before, and where the record companies had previously gone, no, mate, pub rock, not going to happen. They thought, might happen. Ian Dury and the Blockheads. I mean, he had Kilburn and the High Roads, didn't he? But you never know. Sex Pistols. So they let him in, and me too, and Costello. And it was lucky for us that punk came along when it did.
Well, we have to leave it there for this episode, but we will be back with Tom for part 2, when we will learn about the genesis and life of the extraordinary protest song Glad to Be Gay, a perennial rallying cry for the LGBT counterculture. I was very touched by Tom's story and his eloquence and openness about his own vulnerability and very troubled youth. He is, as many people in the UK will know, a brilliant broadcaster as a musician, and we will hear next time more about his music and about his times growing up, going up and out in London, and of course about his activism. I've put links to Tom and of course the music of his first band, Cafe Society, that we heard a track from there in the show notes. As I mentioned at the beginning, if you're listening to this in March 2024 and you can be in London, come and join us at the Horse Hospital when we were celebrating the life and times of another countercultural figure who was always out and proud about his sexuality and about all sorts of other stuff, Allen Ginsberg, bureauoflostculture.com. If not, see you down the road, round the bend and over the hillside. Thanks for listening. Let's finish with Tom's breakthrough song, 2468 Motorway. See ya.
Drop my truck midway to the motorway station. Fairlink was coming up on the left-hand side.